Welcome to the Rugged Truth Podcast. I'm Dr. Bryan Fergus. I am so glad that you are here for this 48th episode of the Rugged Truth Podcast. We've been doing this for a while. And listen, I know that not everybody watches these podcasts as soon as they're released or even in sequential order, but for reference, if you're watching this at some later date, it is December 2022 when I'm recording this. In fact, it's the last podcast I'll record this year. And so I reserve this spot each year. This is the second year, but I'm making it a tradition. I reserve this spot to talk about my 5 best reads of the year. And so this episode of the Rugged Truth Podcast is going to be the 5 best reads of 2022. And I do this because of several reasons. One of them is I just kind of want you to know what I'm taking in, what's influencing what I say when I record these episodes of the Rugged Truth Podcast. If you've been around and heard any of these podcasts, you know that I'm a theology professor. I teach biblical studies, practical theology, ministry issues, as well as systematic theology. And right now, I'm even involved in preaching weekly at this time at a little church that I am helping out. I love it very much. And so I spend a lot of my time studying so that I can have something to say to my students or the people in the church that I'm serving currently. In fact, and people find this weird when I explain what I believe to be my unique calling in ministry. I think one of the 5 things the Lord has called me to do specifically is to read. I consider reading a part of my calling, and so I read widely because I want to have, like I said, things to say, but I also want to think deeply about our faith and how it interacts with different segments of our life as we spend our days on this planet living well for the Lord. 2022 was a crazy year for Dr. Bryan Fergus and the lovely Mrs. Stacy Fergus. We went through a lot of changes. We moved from Phoenix, Arizona. We now live in a little village, in a little cottage, in a little village in the country of central Illinois, and we just absolutely love it. So with all of the change and transition, some of my reading habits got interrupted a little bit. Didn't read as much. But I read deeply. And let me tell you a little something about my reading habits before I just run through my 5 best reads of the year for you. First, you should know that I read challenging books. I try to read up. So one of my professors when I was in grad school kind of drilled this in my mind when I was a young student. He said we always need to challenge ourselves to read harder books. If we just kind of read books that we, immediately comprehend, written at a lower grade level, that we'll never develop intellectually or academically. And so I took him seriously. Dr. Tyler, if you're out there, thank you. I took him seriously and have continued to read up, if you will, challenging books that I got to be honest with you, I don't always agree with the books that I read. In fact, a few of the books that I'm going to share with you today, you should know that I don't agree with everything the authors say. There's one book that I agree with 100% of the time, and that's the Bible. And I've even written books myself, so that should tell you something, all right? And some of the books I intentionally choose knowing that I'm not going to agree with this author, but I want to be able to interact with that particular, thought pattern or position on an issue. I filter what I read through the truth of Scripture. I think that's super important for me. And if you're a follower of Jesus, you got to do that with everything you read. You got to make sure that it lines up with Scripture. And so when I read critically. And in fact, the books that I read, and I'll show you some pages here in a minute, you'll see I scribble notes and things like that. That freaks some bibliophiles or book lovers out. They're like, don't write in your books. Why? They're my books. I paid good money for them. And, I guess they think, if you resell them for posterity, I'm not interested in that. So I take notes in my books and interact with the author and then go back and catalog those notes later. I'm a little nutty with that. But I think there's value right? In listening to people that we don't always agree with. And so that's just something that you should know as we jump into my 5 best reads of 2022. I just want to start with that list right now. And the first book on the list is a book by a man I respect very much. His name is Richard J. Mao, and the book is called How to Be a Patriotic Christian. How to be a patriotic Christian. I'm not a hugely political person, but I do care about the world in which we live. I care about our nation. I care about what's going on and what's maybe stressing out my students and the people who listen to me preach. And so I do kind of stay dialed in. I just lived through the midterm elections, and it was big. It had big consequences. I, like many people, am super concerned about the way politics is dividing our national identity right now. And Richard Mao is a fantastic person to listen to on this topic and to answer this question, how to be a patriotic Christian. Dr. Mao was the president of Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, California for many years, and he's self-identified as a public theologian. That's maybe a category you haven't heard of before, but public theologians are concerned about how our faith interacts with our culture and the political systems that control our culture and so forth. He's very much in the vein of Abraham Kuyper, if you've ever heard of him. And so in this book, what Mao does is he doesn't try to push a partisan agenda. He doesn't do that at all. In fact, after reading this, I couldn't tell you how the man votes at all. He does a great job of staying out of that territory. He wants to get beyond the tribalism, right, that seems to identify politics and even Christian politics right now. He's concerned with the way that politics have hijacked the church to push a particular agenda. And if I could tell you kind of one thing about this book, at the heart of it is encouragement from Dr. Mao to, of course, pray for our government and celebrate when our government does things that the Bible considers as righteous, right? Not what you like as a member of a political party or anything like that, but to celebrate when our government gets it right, regardless of who is in power. With each of these books, what I want to do is just kind of share a quote with you, and the quote that I've chosen is on page 56 of How to Be a Patriotic Christian. Mao writes, "Christians need to find practical ways for making room in our lives for the concerns of people whose life situations are different from our own." That's super important, more important than it might sound at just the quick read. But what Mao is saying is, so much of our personal political opinions are based upon our personal identity. But what about that person who lives in our country who is not like us? And we need to make room in our lives to consider what life is like for them. I loved it. How to Be a Patriotic Christian. I think you ought to read it. It's a fantastic book. Shifting gears a little bit to kind of the practical ministry side is a book that I've mentioned before on the Rugged Truth podcast, but I can't make this list of the best reads of 2022 without mentioning it. And it's called When Narcissism Comes to Church by Chuck DeGroat. DeGroat's a really interesting guy. Like I said, I've mentioned this before, and probably if you're a faithful listener, you've heard me talk about this book just a little bit. But DeGroat is a psychologist. He's also a professor of pastoral care. And the thing that he does that really sparked him to write this book is that he is a church planter evaluator. In other words, you might not know this, but when someone wants to plant a church and they want to do so in partnership with an organization that will help them get off the ground, so to speak, with financial help and prayer support, those people have to go through a process to be approved as church planters. DeGroat is on a committee like that for a large church planting organization here in the States. And one of the things as a psychologist DeGroat started to notice were the symptomology of narcissistic personality disorder. that he was encountering more and more and more among church planners. So he started to study it for evangelical pastors across the country, and found some alarming rates of unhealthiness among church pastors. I think this book is super important. Another aspect of my calling is to help train up the next generation of Christian pastors and ministry leaders to be selfless servants of Christ and his church. And unfortunately, DeGroat has noticed a tendency of pastors in the first quarter of the 21st century to be really more concerned about themselves than anything else. In fact, there's a quote at the beginning of the book on page 7 that I thought I'd share with you that will help you understand kind of the tone of this book. DeGroat writes, ministry leaders and churches today this isn't just the leader's fault, it's the church for putting up with this behavior as well. He goes, ministry leaders and churches today are obsessively preoccupied with their reputation, influence, success, rightness, progressiveness, relevance, platform, affirmation, and power. I use this as a textbook in a couple courses that I teach, because I think that many people step into ministry. I've said this before. Many people step into ministry based concerned about what it can do for them rather than how they can selflessly serve Jesus. It's a growing problem. You can look back at former episodes or previous episodes of the Rugged Truth podcast. There's one called "Celebrity Pastors Must Die," I think, and there's one called 5 or 4 Reasons to Leave Your Church, or 3 or 2 or something like that. And I talk about those issues a little bit more in that. But when narcissism comes to church, I think is a must-read for everyone who cares about the reputation of the Church of Jesus Christ in America today. Not just for pastors, not just ministry leaders, not just elders, especially elder boards though, but even just, if you just attend a church, you need to be aware of these trends and how they might be impacting you personally. All right, I'm going to switch gears now for my third best read. These aren't really ranked, right? This is just number 3. I couldn't put them in, I like this one best order kind of thing. But the third book that's on our list, that's how I'll phrase it, is a book by a guy named John Archibald called Shaking the Gates of Hell. And this is one of those books where I don't agree with everything the author says. But with that said, you should know that John Archibald is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. So he's got some chops, and he lives in Alabama and is a journalist in Alabama. The subtitle of this book really kind of defines or helps you understand what it's about. The subtitle is A Search for Family and Truth in the Wake of the Civil Rights Revolution. So it's really kind of a bit of a memoir from John Archibald, whose grandfathers and father, they were all Methodist ministers in the state of Alabama, serving churches during the 60s, 70s, and even beyond. And one of the things that Archibald was curious about is why Methodist churches in Alabama didn't speak up more vocally during the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a famous little piece called A Letter from a Birmingham Jail that's addressed to the white and Jewish clergy of Birmingham, Alabama. He was arrested and put in jail. He was disappointed that these people, these clergy members didn't come support the civil rights marches, because he believed, of course, MLK believed, that they were doing what God wanted them to do. And so Archibald was bothered by that as well. And so what he did, upon the death of his father, Archibald was given file cabinets full of his father's sermons. And he started reading them from the time of the civil rights, because his father pretty much manuscripted everything. And he noticed that his father didn't really talk much about the civil rights issue. This is always something that's bugged me. I was born 6 months before Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, but I always wondered, why didn't the evangelical church stand up against what I consider to be an injustice done to an entire race of people in America at the time, with segregation and all of these things. And so I picked this book up because it was a question that I had. Why didn't the church do more? I mean, Billy Graham was running crusades during the time. One of those crusades was integrated, where blacks and whites sat together. He got so much blowback for doing that his crusades during that time were segregated from there on out. Why didn't the church stand up and do more about that? I read Archibald's book, and he loves his family, loves his dad very, very much, but he doesn't pull punches. And again, I don't even think that Archibald would self-identify as a Christian these days, and you got to wade through some profane language in this book, but it's a real honest look at how the church interacts at critical moments in culture. I don't want my kids to look back at my life and say, why didn't our dad, in the platforms that he'd been given, why didn't our dad say more about injustices and say more about important, relevant issues? The quote that I want to share with you from Archibald's book comes, again, early in this book, but he's talking about why didn't his father say more about these issues. And he says this: I believe Dad feared losing his congregation, that it was better to have subtle influence than outright rejection. In other words, Archibald concludes that the reason why his dad didn't say much is because he was afraid of getting fired. That's tough. That's tough. When you have to worry about the consequences of being let go because you feel called by God to say the right thing from the pulpit, something is drastically wrong with the church. I got to keep moving, or we're going to run out of time here. The next book that's on my list is, it's just a super important book to me. And it's got a strange title. It's called Hunting Magic Eels by Richard Beck. And if you read it, you encounter in the first few pages why he has actually titled his book that. You should know this about Richard Beck. He's a professor of psychology at Abilene Christian University. And what he's writing about, and he's written about this topic in some other books. One I'm reading right now that I'm enjoying quite a bit by him is called Reviving Old Scratch. It's about spiritual warfare in a disenchanted age. But this subtitle for this book is Recovering an Enchanted Faith in a Skeptical Age. And Beck asserts that our age is no longer an age of enchantment. We live at a time when people are just disenchanted with the world. There's a rise in depression and mental health issues. Beck calls that the ache. And he attributes that to the fact that we've turned our world, science has turned our world into a machine rather than an enchanted place to live, right? A machine in that it's all natural functions moving in unison. He also blames Christianity for the disenchantment. Yeah, how about that? He says that the church, the white evangelical church in America today, has turned our faith into a morality system, rather than being still in tune with things like the mystery of the Trinity, the reality of angels and demons, and all of that. And so this book really challenges that and helps us understand how to recover an enchanted faith. And I got to tell you something, as I read this book, it really changed some things about the way I view my reality as a follower of Jesus. It made some sense of things. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and say that this book, I read this book this year, it found a spot on my top 5 best reads of all time up to this point. Yeah, this book was that transformational for me. And, if you're looking for a book on this list to read, I would really encourage you, if you got money for one of these, this one, because I just really think it helps us understand why the world is the way it is right now, why we are so restless and unhappy in our lives, why anxiety issues are on the rise in our country, why suicide rates are on the rise in our country, what we can do about it in terms of our own personal relationships with the Lord. There's a quote on page 85 of this book that I want to share with you. I think you'll find it as gripping, maybe even shocking as I did. He says this: "But too many Christians are living like atheists, operating as if God doesn't exist. We don't expect to bump into God around the water cooler or doing the dishes. We might believe in God, but we don't expect to encounter God." If you're looking for the recovery of your expectation of encountering God, you should read Hunting Magic Eels by Richard Beck. And you should know that I don't get any portion of the proceeds from this book. It's just really made a huge difference in my walk with the Lord. And that's what these reads are about. The next book that I would, this is number 5 now. It was number 4. Here comes number 5. And it's a simple little book called Silence in the Age of Noise by Erling Kagge. What I have here in my hand is a translation of the book. It was originally written in Norwegian. One of the things that I noticed as I approached kind of the second half of 2022 was there was a theme toward a lot of the that held a lot of the reading that I had in common, and it was just this quest for personal awareness, to actually walk through life with my eyes wide open and not just trudge through life like it's a to-do list, always living in the past or always living in the future. That's how I live. I live either in the past, thinking about things that happened, or the future, thinking about things that I need to do. And so this book reminded me and challenged me to be more present. I noticed that theme in like the Archibald book that I just mentioned, Shaking the Gates of Hell, and the Beck book, Healing Magic Eels. They all have this mindfulness, awareness theme in common. And this book is all about not allowing the noise of life to eat your days. The days that we spend on this planet are finite. We're not going to be in these bodies and in this experience forever. And so this book, not written by a Christian, right? I don't think he would be adverse to Christianity. He's certainly not opposed to it at all. But it's just this encouragement to be present in the now, to listen to yourself, to quiet the noise in your brain and just be. And that's a really important message for me personally right now. I got a quote for you, like I have with all of these books. This one comes from page 52 of this particular edition. You should know, this book has won all kinds of awards and national recognition and international recognition. But Kagge wrote this. Actually, it's 2 quotes, just opposite pages. And it really gripped me. He said, "Yes, we fear death to varying degrees, but the fear of not having lived is even stronger. This fear increases towards the end of life when you understand that it will soon be too late to live. We exist, but few of us actually live," argued Seneca, Greek philosopher, 2,000 years ago, Stoic philosopher. I like those guys. Here's a Seneca quote: "Life is very short and anxious for those who forget the past, neglect the present, and fear the future. When they come to the end of it, the poor wretches realize too late that for all this time they have been preoccupied in doing nothing." Kagge has walked to the South Pole by himself, marched to the North Pole with a partner, climbed Mount Everest. He's a publisher, an adventurer, a real Renaissance man. And this is just a great book that really encouraged me to be very present in the moment. I know I said 5 best reads. I've got a bonus one for you. I encountered this not too long ago, about a month ago. I don't know how I missed this, but it's a little book, and it's called This Is Water by David Foster Wallace. And it's not a usual read for me. In fact, this little book is really all about choosing how we think about the situations in which we find ourselves. There's that mindfulness awareness theme again that I seemed the Holy Spirit drawing me to in the second half of this year. He begins this little book with a parable, and he says this. I'm just going to read it to you. This book is really like a sentence on a page, and I read it in like an hour. Not even, really. He writes this. There's these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming in the opposite direction, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the heck is water?" The idea that David Foster Wallace is trying to communicate in this little presentation is that quite often we don't think very much about the things that are right in front of our face. This is actually a commencement speech, and I listened to it on YouTube, and then I wanted it in print, and so I ordered it. But David Foster Wallace delivered this speech in 2005, and he essentially delivered a speech to the graduates of Kenyon College, telling them that if you don't consistently choose how you're going to think about situations, life will eat you alive. If you don't consistently choose how you're going to frame situations, you will be aggravated, offended, and put off by everything in this life that you think is in your way, when in fact what you're living in is life, which he ends with a great quote. This is water. This is water. This is what life is. Be aware of how you think. I found it super helpful, and I got to the end of the book and actually got to the end of the YouTube video called "This is Water" by David Foster Wallace, and realized that I have been doing life wrong for the last 55 years. That's a sobering thought. But life isn't over yet, and so now I can consistently choose how I'm going to think about certain things. It just really struck me as super important. Well, that's what I've been reading. I mean, I've read a lot, but these are the top reads of 2022. I would encourage you to read. Love God with your mind. That's what he calls us to do. Hope you've enjoyed this little presentation on this episode of the Rugged Truth Podcast. I hope that you will pick up some of these or some others. Tell me what your reading recommendations are. I'm always looking for a good read. God bless you. We'll see you very soon.